Okay, it is 3:01 and we're gonna go ahead and get started. Let us remember that we are in God's holy presence. On behalf of President Livingston, welcome to the second day of our annual Diversity Week. LaSallian's Great Things Are Possible is our theme. Today's session, titled Representation and Access, is going to be facilitated by Dr. Stacy Miller. I am Christy Kelly, Chief Diversity Officer and Multicultural Student Services Director at Lewis, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. Pre-COVID-19, in the wake of COVID-19 and post-COVID-19, our campus communities should commit to diversity, equity, and inclusion for all of its constituents. One way to do so is to sustain spaces like this one to discuss issues or concerns or celebratory items and create calls for action. In a moment, I will share with you Dr. Miller's bio, but I'd like to first announce housekeeping things, and some you already know. I have muted everyone. I would ask that if you have a comment to use the chat box. I'll be monitoring it, and then at the conclusion of Dr. Miller's presentation, we'll open it up to discussion, and we'll try to address all questions should there be any. In addition to the session being recorded, it will be uploaded to the Lewis University YouTube page, and it will include closed captioning. And lastly, unfortunately, I have to say this simply because it's our reality, that if for any reason we are interrupted due to Zoom bombing, I plan to end our session immediately and will be happy to follow up with any of you who would like to continue the conversation. And I know that Dr. Miller will make herself available as well. So Dr. Stacy Miller's professional portfolio includes strategic oversight over the campus climate, as well as retention and student services units, which include the Academic Success Center, the Access and Accommodations Resources Center, and offices of international and multicultural programs. She formerly served as the Director of Residential Life in the Division of Student Affairs at the University of Vermont, a position that she held from 2003 until 2015. She's also the co-founder and managing partner for the Consortium for Inclusion and Equity, LLC, which is a small firm that specializes in integrated diversity education and consulting. Over the course of her career, she has served as an administrator in student affairs and a course instructor for the Higher Education Student Affairs program. She's nationally recognized for her work with affirmative recruitment of diverse staff and educational trainings and workshops on diversity and inclusion. She is also sought out for her knowledge and growing expertise in the use of restorative practices in the collegiate residential settings. She received her Doctorate of Education in Leadership and Policy Studies from the College of Education and Social Services at the University of Vermont, and her BA in Social Sciences and her Master's of Arts in Liberal Studies is from Stony Brook University. She also serves as a Board of Trustee for the International Institute for Restorative Practices Graduate School in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So at this time, we're going to transition and welcome Dr. Miller to lead us into this discussion. So Stacy, I'm going to unmute you, and I am going to make you my host.
Okay.
And it is all yours.
Okay, let's make sure we lock the meeting first.
Yes.
All right. And let me do a screen share. Okay, can everyone see that? All right, awesome. Okay, so this is like my first Zoom ever web kind of presentation. So welcome everyone, and thanks for being here. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules. Well, maybe not so busy with COVID-19, I don't know. But I appreciate your time, and that you're, participating in this conversation. And I want to thank Christy, obviously, for asking me to present today. Obviously, I would have loved to be there in person to do it, but that's not possible. So this is the next best thing, and I hope that you all get something out of it. So as I move this forward, so my presentation is representation, access, and representation. It really doesn't matter in higher education. What does it mean? Why does it matter? And how can we improve? And I'm certainly not just speaking to Lewis, but I'm speaking, in general around higher education, and how we can make access and representation a more prominent part of how we operate and how we function as institutions. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the next hour. I don't know if Christy said this, I can't remember if she said it, but I'm the Associate Provost for Inclusion and Retention at Valparaiso University. And I've been in this role since 2015, and I've learned a lot, even in this new position I've been in for the last 5 years. And I was asked to do this particular presentation at our MLK Day celebration this past year, and I thought that it would be apropos to bring that conversation into the Lewis University community. So when Christy asked me to present, she said, what topics do you think you could talk about? And I said, why don't I talk about access and representation? And she was like, that's great, that's perfect. So again, this is a presentation I did earlier in the year. It's not rocket science. There's nothing in here that I'm probably going to share with you that you don't already know, but really this is a sales pitch to help motivate you and to maybe help you be able to articulate to others why access and representation is so important, I think, within the context of higher education, but really education in general. Because when we're having this conversation about access and representation, it doesn't start at higher education. It doesn't start at colleges and universities. It really starts at the K through 12 system, because that's the feeder and that's the funnel in order to get students into higher ed. So there are 4 questions I'd like you to consider as part of the conversation, and 4 questions that I'll address throughout this conversation. And those questions are, what does it mean to have access in a higher educational context? And what I mean by that is, again, K through 12 and beyond, what does it mean? How do we define access, and what does it take to have access? The second question is, what does it mean to have representation in an educational context? And again, I've created a definition. When I was looking up representation and trying to find some sort of authoritative definition, I couldn't really find one. So I made up my own, because I really felt like I have a handle on representation. I know what it means. I know what it feels like. And so I'll share my definition, my 3-pronged definition of what that looks like. The next piece is, why do access and representation even matter? And if I'll already challenge you to say, if asking that question, you don't have the answer, then you're probably someone who doesn't, you're not impacted on a daily basis by this. People of historically marginalized communities are susceptible to this issue of access and representation, going to places and being in spaces where there's not a lot of those people. If you're someone who's not thinking about this question or doesn't have an immediate answer, it's probably because you're represented, and it's probably because you have access. So consider that as part of your thinking around this conversation. And then the last piece of the presentation, I really want to talk about the 3 ways I think we can improve access and representation. And I'll talk about it at the faculty staff level, I'll talk about it at the student level, and I'll talk about it at the academic or the curriculum level. So with that, I'll move on. So I want to talk a little bit about my story. I think it's important to share kind of the context by which I talk about access and representation. So I call myself a semi-first generational college student. And what I mean by semi is that I'm not the first person in my entire family to go to college, but I'm the first person in my immediate family to go to college. So both my parents attended college but didn't graduate. None of my grandparents went to college or attended, or graduated from college, obviously. But I did have some aunts and uncles that attended college. And I had a cousin who attended college previous to my entering college. And so I say semi because, again, I had some people in my family who went, but none of those people were able to help me kind of manage or navigate that process. It was a process I really had to navigate for myself. So I'm semi in that I had some exemplars in my family, but definitely mostly first because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to apply to college. It was just a process I had to navigate mostly on my own. And I did that because my parents really didn't have any expectations about me going to college. I don't remember conversations of them saying, you got to go to college. This is a must. I think they wanted me to go to college, and I think it was, tacitly talked about in our family, maybe at the grandparent level, but it really wasn't something that was pushed or promoted. My parents didn't have like a college savings fund for me and my brother. We were just living, really, we were working class family, living paycheck to paycheck. So again, college was something I had to navigate on my own. I also had no academic or adult role models in the K through 12 system. And by that, I mean teachers or coaches. And in all of my K through 12 experience, I had no teachers of color. I had no Black teachers. It didn't mean there weren't any in my school, but I never had the opportunity to learn or from those or have them as teachers. And that includes, again, at the coaching levels, because I was a big athlete in junior high and high school. So again, that was something that it wasn't a problem. I mean, I loved my teachers and, they were great people, but it would have probably been nice to have someone who looked a little bit like me teach me. So that's just something to note. So the question then becomes, how did I make it to college? How did I get here? What motivated me to leave the K through 12 system and actually enter into college? And I took a pretty circuitous route to getting my doctorate. I started off in community college. I wound up attending Stony Brook University, which is actually very close to my home. And then I did my master's there and eventually did my doctorate at UVM. But when I think about how I made it through school, it's like, what led me down that path? What motivated me to do that? And the one thing I definitely say was the motivator for me was representation, this idea of representation. I had exposure to college in the form of my friends, especially my Black and brown friends. Most of those folks were either second generation college students, because I grew up in a predominantly white affluent community, and some of my best friends, and two of my best friends, in fact, who are still my best friends to this day, we're all pushing 50 now and we're still friends. My friend Tony, her parents were both teachers, and so she's a second generation college student. And my friend Jackie's parents were immigrants from Jamaica who came here for a better life. And obviously there was the expectation that she would go to college. Her and her brother would go to college. She has a twin brother, and so do I. So this is kind of how we were all friends in weird ways. But having those two people as friends really pushed me to want to go to college, because I saw what they were doing. I saw how they were navigating that process. I saw that within their families, it was an expectation. And because of the closeness of our relationships and our sisterhood circle, it was just natural for me that I kind of gravitated to them and cling to them in that way, and learned that this is a path or a route that I should be taking too. And so I credit them very much so for, and it's funny because I thought about it today and I was like, I've never told this to them. Like, so I need to do that at some point and be like, the reason I went to college is because of you, so just to give them some love and some props. But it was being in their presence and seeing how they were navigating school and watching their route that really helped me. And so I very much credit representation for making sure that I attended college and I got through that process. And I'm very proud of that. I'm proud that I still have those friendships and relationships that have kind of motivated me through this process. So let me, that's a little bit about me and my context to help kind of define the rest of the presentation. And so I want to move into talking about access, right? What does it mean to have access in an educational context? So great schools and partnerships glossary of education reform, and I can't see the entire PowerPoint because of the way hang on, I'm trying to move the thing a little bit. So glossary of education reform says the following about access. This is how it defines access. Sorry. So in education, the term access typically refers to the ways in which educational institutions and policies ensure or strive to ensure that students have equal or equitable opportunities to education, right? Pretty cut and dry. But I want to pinpoint two words in particular in this paragraph so that we're all clear. And I'm sure you all have heard these analogies or these explanations of the words equal and equitable in the past. You know, again, they're two words that I think often get confused or conflated with one another, but they're very different things. And both are needed when we're talking about the idea of access. So equal obviously means same. It means that you get what I get and I get what you get. We get exactly the same thing. Equitable is a little bit different. And the way I like to explain equitable is if, just to use the analogy quickly, if we were actually physically together in a space and I asked everybody like, you need a pair of shoes, but we're gonna do this as a test. Take off your shoes and put them in a pile in the room, and then everybody go get a pair of shoes, right? That is not your pair of shoes. Go to that pile and pick up a pair of shoes that doesn't belong to you, right? I could go back and say, okay, look, everybody has shoes now. We're all equal. Everybody has shoes. Equitable means though that you have shoes that actually fit you, right? Because if I pick up somebody else's shoes, they might fit me, but they might not. And in all likelihood, they probably won't, right? So equitable is this idea that I get what I need, what I exactly need, right? I need a pair of shoes, but I also need a pair of shoes that fit my feet. And so when we're talking about access, we're talking about creating systems that provide people equal access, the same access, but also access that's customized to their particular needs, their own learning needs, right? And so this may require a school to provide additional services or remove barriers that might prevent some students' ability to participate in courses or academic programs. I may have a physical disability or a learning disability that requires more or less or something. So what we're talking about when we're talking about access is making sure people have equal access to the same facilities, the same courses, and also making sure that those barriers to those courses and those facilities are not there. The third part of the Great School and Partnerships definition is the understanding that, you know, we all know this again. This is nothing I'm telling you or saying, is stuff that you don't already know, right? But there are lots of factors that contribute to creating barriers to access. And those things include race, gender, physical or intellectual ability, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, past academic performance. You know, I can't tell you how often, you know, I talk to people who talk about, you know, this has been held against me. You know, I was this kind of student and I could never break out of that mold as a student. And I was always seen in this particular way. So past academic performance can be a barrier. Language, obviously, we know we're growing into a more multilingual society, right? So language could be a barrier. Income, of course. Community influence is huge. I keep hearing lots of stories about that now, in which areas or particular schools are cutting programs, and that only affluent people who can pay into those programs now, you know, whether it's athletics or music or extracurriculars, they can participate, where people who can't afford to do that can't. Obviously, geographical location and school facilities play a huge part in creating barriers. And then, of course, the intersectionality of all those things or the circumstances by which people are living can create barriers, right? It may not just be solely race. It's often race and economics. It's often, you know, a number of different things that are interconnected that create those barriers. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about access. We're talking about, again, making sure that our identities, whether they're innate or whatever, making sure that those are not barriers, and making sure that we're creating equal access, and that we're making sure that things are equitable, and we're creating a system in which everyone has access. So that's what we're talking about when we use the term access. So I want to move now to representation and talk a little bit about what that means. And these are my definitions again, and I'm basing these on my lived experience. So for me, representation in education means having people, students, faculty, and staff, and I use staff as the umbrella term for everything that's non-faculty. So administrative staff, senior leadership, executive, whatever, we're all on some level staff members, but you're either a student, you're a teacher, or you're a staff member who's helping to run the institution. And what I mean by representation is, again, as having a representation of multitude and intersecting identities present in academic and social spaces within any institution. I want to look out in a classroom and see a multitude of different kinds of people represented. I want to look out in any social space and see the same thing, and hopefully in the most ideal situation, see those people engaging and interacting with one another. Unfortunately, we see far too often still segregation in those spaces, but representation is obviously that first step to doing that. The next thing, sorry, move the slide along. The next piece of my definition is representation provides those, again, who attend and work at the institution the ability to see themselves reflected back within their community, which can create a sense of comfort. And again, if you're someone who can't relate to that statement, you're probably someone who is used to being in spaces or places where you're represented to the point where it's invisible or you don't even think about it. I am the only person of color on the president's cabinet, and I am one of 2 people on the provost cabinet or council at my institution. So in certain conversations, depending on what we're talking about, I have to be the spokesperson for my community or for historically underrepresented students, faculty, and staff. And that can be difficult. And sometimes it can feel, I can feel disconnected. Sometimes I feel uncomfortable. And sometimes I wonder and have conversations, internal conversations and dialogue, like, do I belong here? Is this okay? Should I? And so when you have more people who look like you, it often makes you feel better. There's also a comfort level that comes with that. And again, that sense of belonging. I think the third piece of my definition, representation exposes all community members with the opportunity to work, live, and engage with difference while also finding connection, and connection helps us all to thrive and be successful. We all know this. Again, I don't know if you all are familiar with Brene Brown. She's one of my heroes. She's she's a professor at the University of Houston. She does a lot of work on shame. She's got a lot of TED Talks. She hangs out with Oprah Winfrey, so she's super, super cool. But she talks about connection is like a basic life function. We have to, as human beings, we have to be connected. And when there's representation and we're able to connect with others who are like us or share identities like us, it does help us to thrive. It does help us to be successful. It does help us to move us forward. And I go back again to my example of my girlfriends, Jackie and Tony, who I grew up with and who helped me to move into college, the college realm. Without their representation, I don't think I would have been able to do that successfully. So I want to move into why does it matter? Why does this even matter? Why is it important? And again, I put the question out there that if you're unsure of why it matters, it may be because you don't have to think about it, because you're represented, because you've always had access, and because you're represented. I think the question always resonates a little bit stronger with the people who experience that type of marginalization, or who experience that kind of discomfort. And so, I'm going to talk about, again, why it matters from a number of different angles. And the first is access and representation creates access, and it's cyclical. It's this circular thing. The more access we give to people, specifically those from underrepresented groups, the more representation happens, and then as a result, more access happens. So it definitely goes hand in hand with one another. Diverse teachers, diverse leadership, and diverse school cultures create higher expectations, stronger communities, and better outcomes from students and staff. This is what studies are proving over and over again. And I'll talk about one in particular, a McKenzie study that's around business. But is around the same context around diversity and how diversity strengthens communities and really creates better outcomes. So we know this through ongoing research.
Dr. Miller?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can. I'm sorry to interrupt. So I just got a message from our provost who wants to get into the meeting. Can you please unlock unlock them? Sure. Thank you.
Okay, hang on one second. Let me go.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I just don't know what I'm doing. Okay, I'm unlocking. You have unlocked the meeting?
Okay, perfect.
Did you join?
I'm not sure. I'll send them a message. Yeah. Okay.
I'm looking for the participant number to go up. So
yes.
once I see it go up, I'll lock it. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes, perfect.
Okay. Hang on. Okay, so that should say Johns Hopkins. I don't know what happened. I thought I changed it in my original thing, but somehow I didn't catch. So I apologize. But that should say Johns Hopkins University. But they did a study fairly recently, and their study was specifically around race. And one of the things they talked about is if a Black student has just one Black teacher by third grade, that student is 13% more likely to enroll in college. And those who have two Black teachers are 32% more likely. So almost 3 times more likely to attend college. And I thought that was, that's huge, right? That exposure, that representation. One of the things I didn't share with you all, which probably I should have in the very beginning, when I first went to college, I went to college to be a teacher. I wanted to be a K through 12 teacher. I had a pretty positive experience in K through 12. For the most part, there was some bumps and bruises along the way, but for the most part, it went well. And I really was interested in giving back in that capacity. But when it came time to begin to really navigate that process of teaching, I wound up actually changing my mind and not doing it. And I do think that was in part because I had never seen a teacher like me. It was hard to conceptualize and to see myself in that role. And even though I think I still am a teacher to this day because of the work I do, I've taught classes in a college setting. I obviously facilitate lots and lots and lots of workshops. So there's a lot to what I do that has a teaching element to it. I just couldn't see myself in front of a classroom of students. And I definitely think that was in part because I had never seen what that would look like and how people would respond to me. And it was just so uncomfortable. So I feel like there's a connection between my own experiences in that study, but also, again, just when you see yourself reflected out, it's easier to see yourself in those roles or those positions. I think the last piece, there was a study by Penn State called The Importance of Student Representation, and they talked about role models, how role models play an important role in everyday life. Again, information you already know, right? It's pretty cut and dry. Role models motivate us and they inspire us. And when we see ourselves reflected back in others, it gives us some sort of a roadmap as to how we can manage, navigate, and traverse the world. So all these studies talk about why access and representation matter, and particularly why representation matters. Other things. So McKenzie is a company that does a lot of large scale kind of surveys, and they do analysis, and they're a pretty popular and well respected firm in the country. And in 2015, they did a report on 366 public companies, trying to figure out, okay, how does diversity impact, or how does representation impact the success of those companies? And these are the things that they found in their study. Sorry. The first was that those in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity in management were 35% more likely to find financial returns above the industry mean. So whatever the average was, 35% higher when you had diverse management. And I'm talking specifically about leadership. Same was true for them around female gender diversity. So 15% more likely to have returns above meaning the industry mean when the leadership level was more diversely represented by gender, which I found really fascinating. The third thing they found was that those who were more diverse at the leadership team level, they focused more on facts, that they processed those facts more carefully, and that they were more innovative. And I like to use the example. First of all, I know this to be true. I love this study because I'm like, yeah, this is making the business case for why representation, diversity matters. I think it's really important. And the best case study I can use to talk about this is really Apple. I'm sure many of you use Apple products or have some Apple products. I'm on an Apple laptop right now. I have iPads, I have all kinds of devices, but Apple is a company, excuse me, that while its leadership isn't that diverse, I mean, it's very male heavy. There's 4 women to 12, there's 12 executives at Apple. There are 4 women, 8 men. It is diverse ethnically. There is some racial diversity, and the company itself as a whole is a very, very diverse company. And when you think about Apple, it's a company that does focus more on facts than other companies. And it takes and processes those facts more carefully. And the example that I love to use is the Apple Watch. I don't know how many of you own an Apple Watch or have an Apple Watch, but Apple was a company that when a lot of companies started getting into the digital watch game, they were kind of late to the party. They took their time, and some of that was they really wanted to spec out what was going on in the market. Did people really want digital watches? And of course, they wanted to make the best, most innovative digital watch that could be made. And so they took their time. And so while other companies jumped into the market really feet first and did well, Apple Watches by far have exceeded the success of all of those other watch companies, tenfold. In fact, Apple Watches are the most purchased watches in the world over even any digital or any analog watch. More Apple Watches are out there. So Rolex, no, you're not winning. Apple's winning. Apple's winning in everything. And that to me is in part because of its diverse staff, its diverse workforce, its diverse leadership. It's a leadership group that, again, it focuses on facts. It studies those facts more carefully, and everything they do is with intention. Everything they do is to make sure that their products are intuitive, easy to use, and that there's real purpose and meaning to use them, right? Apple Watches are multifunctional. They're not only health equipment watches, but they're watches that allow you to do email and do text messaging. There are even instances and cases where Apple Watches have saved people's lives. There was a woman who reported that she was out in the middle of the ocean. I guess she was like, what is that called? Paddle boarding or something. And she got swept out further into the ocean than she wanted to, and she couldn't get back to shore. And she wound up using her Apple Watch, which was connected to her cellular device, to make a phone call for distress and get help. And the Coast Guard was able to come and pick her up. And then there are lots of stories, of course, of people who have used their Apple Watch in an accident or something like that. So, I don't have an Apple Watch. I have a Fitbit watch, and it can't do any of the things that an Apple Watch can do, but I can't afford an Apple Watch right now. So that's just the way it goes. But, but yeah, that's a company that, to me, that exemplifies the McKenzie report and the ways in which it's functioning at the highest levels. A couple more things. Conclusion: teams that are more diversely represented are often smarter, because you can imagine that when you're bringing in a multitude of ideas and perspectives, you're going to get better results. And that's what diversity and representation often do. Other things I want you to think about. I don't know if you all know who Paul LeBlanc is. I'm sure you've seen him, though, several times. He is the president of Southern New Hampshire College. And he's often on TV talking, and he stole a very famous quote, and I don't know who the quote's from, but I know it's not his. And that is this quote: The world is in which we live equally distributes talent, but doesn't equally distribute opportunity, and our paths are not always the same. And I love that quote because it's true. It's profoundly true. Um, in any given population of people around the world, in any given population of people around the world, think of any corner of the world, think of any culture, think of any country, there are geniuses who lay dormant, often because they don't have access to the same opportunities that other people have. And that is profoundly both sad and amazing to me, because I'm like, do you know how much ingenuity, how much knowledge, how many gifts are out there that are just laying dormant because we're not giving people, we're not creating the funnels or not creating the pathways to give people access to the things that they need to be successful and to be their best selves. And so that's for me why access is so important. For me, it's an intrinsic thing. It's a humanitarian issue. I like to tell this story. I remember when I was consulting, I put in a proposal to do a project for a company, and I happened to be in a waiting room with another firm that had bid for this project, and we were just casually talking, and I was talking to one of the other people in the other firm, and I don't know how we got into this whole conversation, but she was talking about her grandmother and how her grandmother was this kind of like older, bitter person. And I was like, oh, what's that about? And she said, yeah, well, my grandmother she was a great musician. She was a piano prodigy, but when she was young and during her life and the time, at that time in her life or in the world, women weren't allowed to go to school. So she didn't get to go to school, but her brother did. And her brother wasn't as good a pianist as she was. And so she was always kind of bitter about that he got this opportunity to go to college and go to school and that she didn't. And the only reason she didn't get to go was because she was a woman. And it just kind of was always kind of this thing that gnawed on her. And I was like, oh, and as part of that conversation, we began to talk, and I was like, yeah, you know how much wasted talent there is in the world because people just don't have access? And she was like, yeah. And so for me, that story hit home for me when I think about access and representation. It's like, what are we losing? What human potential are we losing when we do this, right? Everyone has a vocation, a calling, a strong sense of purpose, passion, and meaning. I'm sure you all know this language as Lasallians, right? This is part of your culture, your institutional culture, much like it is at my institution at Valparaiso. We believe that every single person has value and every single person has something to contribute to the world. But if people aren't given access, and if you don't see yourself reflected back in spaces where then, okay, I see this person, they're doing it, I can do it too. How does that impact your success as a human being, and what does that do to your contributions to the world? Any time any one of us does not have access or is negatively impacted because of the lack of representation that's out there, we are really limiting our collective opportunity to succeed as a group of people, as a species. I believe that. And I also know this for a fact: we cannot solve the complicated problems of the world with limited representation. There are too many problems. There's too many things going on in the world where you need to open the doors. You need to have a lot of people at the table to solve the problem. You know, I don't mean to veer too political, but like, I'm sorry, Jared Kushner, you can't solve peace in the Middle East by yourself. That's not possible. You can't solve peace in the Middle East without people from the Middle East being at the table to help you come up with the ideas and to talk about culture and conflict and all the things that make that situation complicated. I'm sorry, men, you can't solve women's reproductive rights without women at the table. We have to have representation. We have to provide people access so that we can get a diverse perspective. We can get diverse perspectives and diverse ideas at the table. For me, again, there's a real cost, the loss of human potential and contributions to the world when we're not giving people access and representation. And I like to use these next photos as a way to really, hammer that point home. I'm sure some of these people you might know, but you might not know. I don't know. And so I want to talk a little bit about each of them, because they're people that changed the world. They're people that contributed greatly to society, to technology, and whom had to obviously endure a lot of hardship in order to get where they were. And some of them, unfortunately died along that path. The first person I want to talk about is, his name is Srinivasa Ramanu John, and he was an Indian-born mathematical genius who, without any formal training and in almost formal isolation from mathematical education, formal mathematical education, solved mathematical problems that were at the time considered unsolvable. He was a devout Hindu. He at the time, obviously, Indian was a British colony, and so he would send his mathematical work to England to have people review it, and eventually they brought him from India to Britain to study. And his works include contributions to mathematical analysis, number theory, infinite series, and continued fractions. If you want to know more about his life, you can obviously Wikipedia him, but you can also watch the movie, The Man Who Knew Infinity. He studied at Trinity College, which is a subsidiary of the University of Cambridge in England, but he really struggled. I mean, he was literally a genius. He attributed most of his mathematical knowledge to his spiritual faith as a Hindu. And one of the interesting things about him is that he was able to do math without proofs. Like, he could just see a problem and have the answer without showing the work, I guess, to get there. And that was just unheard of at the time. People were like, how do we know this is right if you can't prove it? And he's like, I know because of God, and they were like, well, that's not an answer. And there was just a lot of strife. He went to school in England in a time when I think it was World War II, so there was a lot of food scarcity. He was a devout Hindu, as I said earlier, and he wound up kind of being malnourished because he didn't eat meat, and wound up getting tuberculosis, and eventually went back to India and passed away there. But in between did just amazing mathematical work that is today still sought after, used, and is the basis of so much of the study of mathematics. So just an amazing person, but struggled because he was the only one at an institution, and at a time when it was just highly racist, and when people just didn't regard him as really having the knowledge and the skills that he had. The next three people that you probably know their names. You probably don't recognize their faces because they're famous. A movie was made about them called Hidden Figures, and so Dorothy Vaughan, Katherine G. Johnson, and Mary Jackson were the main characters of the movie Hidden Figures, and all equally contributed to the NASA space program, and helping make sure that our first space launches went off. Dorothy Vaughan was an American mathematician and human computer who worked for NASA. And the Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. In 1949, she became the acting supervisor for the West Area Computers and the first African-American woman to supervise a group of staff at the center. She's considered the mother of modern computing. Again, as detailed in the movie, she was the person who got the IBM computer running when no one else could do that. And so it's interesting how our history is snatched from us, right? Like, I don't know any Black female computer people. No, actually, that's not true. I know one. Her name is Sharon Lane, and she works at my university. But I know one, right? And the mother of modern computing was a Black woman. Yet that's not an area that there's a lot of representation of African American women, and that's not an area that African American women get funneled to, and you wonder why. Katherine Johnson, again, she was the main character in the movie. She was a again, another mathematical genius, and was the person who helped them figure out the orbital calculations for the space flight. Without her, we probably wouldn't have gotten into space. And I say that with a little bit of, would we have figured it out? Yeah, probably eventually, but not in the time frame that we needed to figure it out. And she was instrumental to that. And then obviously Mary Jackson was the first engineer, first Black engineer for NASA. And so major contributions. Of course, we also have Morgan Garrett, or Garrett Morgan, excuse me, got his name backwards, who's an American inventor, businessman, and well-known and influential politician. His most notable inventions are the 3-position traffic signal and what was called at the time the smoke hood, but what we know now as the gas mask. And you can imagine that both of these inventions have saved probably millions of lives, in the span of time since we've had both of those things. I mean, can you imagine how people got around before the traffic light? How do you know it was your turn to go, right? So, and obviously the gas mask was used in both World War I and World War II, and saved, again, probably hundreds of thousands of lives. Vivian Thomas, there was another movie made about him. He was an American laboratory supervisor for Johns Hopkins University, but he helped develop the procedure used to treat blue babies. There was a time in which when children were born with a heart condition that basically did not allow blood to flow properly through their bodies, and they would literally be blue. And he basically pioneered the procedure that helped to end that problem, and obviously extend the life expectancy of those children astronomically. So he was never able to go to college and do his doctorate because he was not afforded access, but still was instrumental in creating a procedure that really, again, has saved thousands of lives. And then the last person, Dr. Shirley Jackson, and note doctor, right? Out of all those people, and literally that timeline leads to her. She is an American physicist, the 18th president of Rensselaer Polytech Institute, and she's the first African-American woman to have earned a doctorate at MIT. She's also the second African-American woman in the United States to earn a PhD in physics and was awarded the National Medal of Science. She also served, I know, in President Obama's one of his educational cabinets, but her most notable achievements are the touch-tone phone, caller ID, and fiber optic cable, all things that we take for granted on a daily basis, but she invented those things. And so you see the trajectory of access and representation. You see how it can be powerful. You see how it can change lives. It can change the world. It can save lives. It can save the world. And so with that, I'm going to quickly get into the 3 ways in which we can improve representation, access and representation in higher education. The first one is cultivate academic partnerships with historically diverse schools to create relationships of support and transparency, and allow those schools to be feeder schools into your institution. I don't know if this is something that Lewis does. The University of Vermont did this really, really successfully, but we found partnership schools in New York that we worked with and we connected with, and we basically cultivated students from those schools and brought them to the University of Vermont to provide them with access, to provide representation, and to provide those students an opportunity to get into higher education. And those programs still exist today, and they're still very, very successful. I don't know how much Lewis does around that particular area, but that might be one way to create more access and more representation at your institution. The second thing is address implicit bias during faculty and staff hiring processes to ensure that historically underrepresented folks don't get overlooked during those processes. Implicit bias, unconscious bias, whatever you want to call it, there's so much research about that right now. Just amazing work is being done about to understand the brain and how it works, and how even the littlest things we do can put people into the no pile. And so really focusing on that and understanding that we need to have affirmative processes that are clear, that make sure that we're measuring the skills and the knowledge of people along that process, and not, weeding people out for things that are extraneous or not important. I think that's really a huge part of making sure there's more access and representation at both the faculty and staff level. And the last piece I'll talk about is access and representation is not just people, it's also pedagogy, it's curriculum, it's learning materials, it's making sure that that we look at course content or a discipline and we acknowledge the impact and the input that all groups have put into that particular discipline, right? Whether it's English, whether it's math, whether it's chemistry, there's no group that hasn't had some impact or some part in the success of a particular field or discipline. And allowing students to know the history behind the people who have done chemistry or math or nursing or whatever the discipline, I think it's really important. And making sure that, if you're teaching English, you're not just focusing on these writers, but that you're broadening that paintbrush of writers that people can learn from and grow from. I think is really vitally important as part of the higher education experience. And so with that, I have talked for 51 minutes. I can't believe it. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to take questions. There may be questions already out there, who knows, but fire away. I don't profess to know every answer, but I certainly will do my best to answer any questions you have.
So first and foremost, Stacey, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise and your wisdom. So I'd like to start there, not necessarily a question, but a comment more than anything. I am looking through the chat box as we speak, and I don't have any questions that have been raised so far. So what I'd like to do is give folks an opportunity to process for a few minutes. We have about 8 minutes left on the call. Are there any initial responses to what Stacey has shared with us? And if you don't want to put it in the chat box, no issues, just use the reaction feature where you can kind of put that little fun hand up, what I just did, or feel free to do a thumbs up. And then I will make sure that you have an opportunity to ask your question or make your comment. And while we wait for hands or thumbs up, Stacey, I do have a question. There's sometimes a notion of the zero-sum game, right? Access and representation. Can you talk for a few moments about the zero-sum game and what that might mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest problems. First of all, I think the zero-sum game is a cultural issue. I think it's it's scarcity model thinking for me. The idea that, in order for me to be successful, I have to take something from someone, or we can't both be successful at the same time. And I don't believe that, number one. I think it's ridiculous because everybody doesn't need and want the same things at the same time. So, and we all want to be successful. And I think that we all benefit when all of us is successful, right? I mean, that's part of, we kind of we have these two things that are in constant conflict with one another, the zero-sum idea, but also understanding and knowing that we all benefit when other people are successful. And we tout that as a university. We talk, right? We want every single one of our graduates to be successful. We want them to give back. We want people to stay connected and healthy, etc. So I don't have much to say about it, in that I just don't believe it. I don't think it's real. And I think we need to, as often as we can, we need to basically push back on that kind of thinking, because to me it's scarcity model thinking. It's there's not enough, you know, and I don't believe that. There's an abundance. We just need to figure out how to divide it up, how to share it, how to give people what they need, instead of thinking about solely ourselves. So I'd love to hear anybody else's perspective on that too. So
if anyone else has a response to my question or Stacy's reply, feel free to raise your hand or give the thumbs up. And in the meantime, I just want to share, Stacy, that through the chat box, you've been thanked, and the comment is that you shared some really great examples on why access matters. So again, thank you for that. Thank you for that.
And I will be getting Christy this PowerPoint. So feel free to use it, take it, do whatever you want with it. It's not, again, nothing I've said or prepared is rocket science. Really, what I was trying to make is the more emotional case for this. And I'm glad that some of the examples I use are helpful in that. And I'm sure that as you think about it, you'll come up with your own. And I think that's the best way to change people's perspectives and their minds, is through, you know, is by sharing personal lived examples and stories about your own life and how access and representation has made a difference for you. And I think that's what moves and motivates people. So
excellent, excellent. Well, seeing none, I'll make just the similar announcement to our start, and I apologize for those who weren't able to join us right at 3, and for any technical reason that was locked out, if you will. So this particular presentation will be made available post Diversity Week. So within the next few days or so, with closed captioning on the university's YouTube channel. So one of the participants has asked if they could get a copy of the recording, and the answer is yes. It will be made available to the public on our website. And so you will be able to have access to it and to share it with your colleagues. And I know this question came from Oswego Community School District. So yes, it will be made available. Well, if there aren't any more questions or comments, I thank you all for spending time with Dr. Miller and I this afternoon. This concludes our time together. Again, this is the second of 5 that will happen this week, and we invite you to come back tomorrow to have diversity dialogue inspired by Brian Stevenson, the attorney who does phenomenal work for death row inmates. And his book is called Just Mercy, and there is a movie depicted about his work. So we'll be on at 3 o'clock. I thank each and every one of you. And if I didn't answer questions or you didn't get a chance to talk openly today, feel free to reach out to me. And I know Dr. Miller has made herself available for further communication. So thank you all very much, and be well.
Thank you as well. Thank you all.